So in front of you is a piece of paper, and it should be blank side up. And what I would like you to do is write, I just want you to answer just off the top of your head. I'm going to ask you 3 questions, and I just want you to write down the first thing that comes to your head. So question number 1. Could this be the end of the world? Could this be the end of the world? Number 2, is it possible that we're living in the end times? Is it possible we're living in the end times? Three, how does that language sit with you? What word comes to mind? How does that language sit with you, or what's it evoke? So about halfway through the presentation, I'll have you turn that piece of paper over. There's a section of the paper that will only make sense kind of if you see it. It'll be better, where I have some fun with words. But I want to just present to you an idea, and then I want to have a discussion about it. And I have some places where I'll just break. But if you can't wait for the breaks to give some feedback or comments or questions or concerns, then you can just jump in at any point. I'm pretty good at picking up where I left off. So I've entitled this, I was given the title, Composting Christendom, which I liked. And I've entitled this specific presentation, Following Furiosa, Church at the End of the World. If you don't know who Furiosa is, you will in about 10 minutes. We have passed from one era into another. The changes hinted at in our language, mostly by the proliferation of post-labels, postmodern, post-colonial, post-structural, but a significant and a sustained rate of change and fragmentation that is evident across our society and increasingly our globalized world. It's popular to refer to ours as the information age, which is in contrast to the industrial age, which supplanted the agrarian age. So here's some dates I find interesting. In 1969, somebody said it was the dawning of the age of Aquarius. You may be familiar with that. 1968, Time had its cover story asked, "Is God dead?" In 1972, we put a pin that's the beginning of the postmodern era with the demolition of the housing project in St. Louis. July 15th, 1972, to be specific. The Vietnam War left many in the early 70s disillusioned on the heels of Watergate, Woodstock, and the early assassinations of JFK and MLK. In 1971, John Cobb was already asking if it was too late for the environment. Hal Lindsey put out the late great Planet Earth, and it was also in this window that the global conceptions changed. In 1969, the first moon landing. 1970 was the first Earth Day celebration. 71 was the founding of Greenpeace. And in 72, we got that famous picture of the Earth as the little blue marble. So in that window from 68 to 73, that's going to be my target to say, if we move from one era to another, I'm going to propose that that's when it happened. That's when the shift happened. Whether you call it the dawning of the age of Aquarius or whatever you want to call it, something changed in that window. So this brief sample of cultural moments is more than just anecdotal, and it may be illuminating how it impacted both our imaginary and our collective societal psyche. Because in the shadow of these historic shifts, there are 2 impactful memes that had a profound impact on my childhood and somewhat inform this thesis. So as an American evangelical growing up in the 80s, I was haunted by 2 ominous threats: the Cold War nuclear threat and the imminent return of Jesus. Now we joke about those drills that they made us do as kids, where when the alarm would sound, whether it was for a tornado or a nuclear bomb, we were supposed to hide under these little metal desks that had a wooden top hinged at the back, which opened up and all our school supplies went in. How that would stop a nuclear explosion, I have no idea. I think it was mostly for the method of control. But that really traumatized me in my formative years, this living under this constant threat of nuclear attack. The second looming crisis was the rapture of God's chosen and the return of Christ for a millennial reign. And popular manifestations of this were immortalized in such memorable things as those bumper stickers that said, in the case of the rapture, this car will be unmanned. I wish I could still get one of those. Street corner prophets holding signs that said, repent, the end is near. Movies like The Thief in the Night. Anyone see that? It's terrifying. Thief in the Night. And popular songs such as I Wish We'd All Been Ready. That'll mess with a kid when you sing that around a campfire. So one needed to always be in a sinless state or perpetually in repentance or state of grace, depending on one's tribe, in case the trumpet should sound and the Lord should return. So setting aside the concerns about the potential trauma to one's psyche to live under such imminent disasters, I want to consider the possibility that there is something good, actually, about the delay or perpetual deferral, however you look at it, of the Parousia and the unfulfilled expectations of Armageddon, and how it might provide for us a desire to seize an alternative and move towards an ecological civilization which operates by a different economy. So my proposal is this. Would it be possible for those of us who occupy the mainline, progressive, enlightened, educated, and post-something positions to refrain from collective eye-rolling, mocking, and confrontational apologetics in order to instead adopt a posture of cautious agreement on the state of the world and inhabit an irenic desire to effect change through coalitions with our evangelical, fundamentalist, charismatic, and conservative sisters and brothers by agreeing that this is indeed the end? If we agreed with them that this is the end, could we get more done? That's my proposal. So I'm actually suggesting it would be a relatively simple adaptation to put our energy into channeling the flood of popular opinion that something's wrong with the world, that society's going down the toilet, however it gets phrased. Instead of resisting that, which seems like an uphill battle, and trying to hold back the mounting pressure with facts and stats, instead to roll with it and channel that energy. Many look at the state of the world and the images provided in the nightly news, and they think these are signs of the end. It would not, therefore, seem like too big of a leap to suggest that we've already crossed the threshold and are currently living in those end times. Admittedly, there was no angelic trumpet blast. There was no tearing of the sky, no physical return, no rapture. But sometimes God's work is easy to miss. And so to introduce the idea of recognizing it a posteriori, that you see God from behind when God is already past. It's how we recognize the work on the cross as the early churches, and possibly how we have entered into this last era. So obviously that reading's up for a debate, and a case can be made for a poetic or political approach to the apocalyptic expectations of our first century texts. What is not debatable is that something has changed in our world, and we now live in a different era. Our time in the West is notable for 4 profoundly distinguishable markers of a culture amiss. I would suggest that these are due to our having entered into a new era while failing to perceive that we have done so. And regardless if someone agrees with me on my assertion here, our society is permeated by 4 increasingly intensifying marks of a delay or a deferral of the expected Parousia. And these indicators, and I've alliterated them to make them easy to remember, are discouragement, dysfunction, decline, and disaster. Discouragement, dysfunction, decline, and disaster. Discouragement can be perceived in a range of manifestations, from a pervasive malaise to widespread depression and eventually outright despair. We are plagued by a boredom of epidemic proportions and defeated resignation in the face of endless consumerism and unsatisfying work and family commitments. Dysfunction. It's represented by everything from our divorce rates to our governmental gridlock as seen in our unproductive Congress. Decline references the areas such as the shrinking attendance in the mainline denominations, and faith as a whole, American exceptionalism in the global community, and the failing education standards of our young people. Disaster is seen in visible examples of oil spills washing up on our shores, economic crashes resulting in bailouts of the too big to fail banks, the automotive industry, and our dubious inability to end multiple wars. So discouragement, dysfunction, decline, and disaster. Conversations about the demise of Christendom and the effects of globalization on nationalism and immigration, the failures of both capitalism and Marxism to deliver on their promises, the dysfunction of our democracy, not to mention the confusing blips of movements like the Arab Spring in the Middle East, the Occupy movement in the US, and Idle No More in Canada. This is perhaps, and this is where we enter into this fun with the words thing, why so many people who are religious, it's an RE word, so religious organizations resort to reclamation projects in rejection to the perceived problems that result from our denial or failure to recognize that we have indeed entered into a new and different era, a place we have never been before. So if you want to turn over this sheet of paper, and I apologize, I actually printed out your copies before I caught a couple typos. I got ambitious and printed it out early. So, the impulse to reach back into the imagined past and attempt to salvage some measure or order in order to reorient ourselves to this new landscape is understandable. The danger, however, is resounding as we imagine, or as we endeavor to become, what is a fantastic book title, The Way We Never Were. It is notable how many contemporary theological projects employ a motive that begins with the prefix RE. Before I provide that list, let me just say that there are some important and biblical words that begin with RE. Both reconciliation and restoration are two indispensable examples. Two other powerful words that would complete that constellation would be repentance and reparations. And I can say a whole bunch of that and how those four might lead us into the 21st century. But unfortunately, those four RE words are not the ones that I see and hear most Christians in the many Christian circles using. While revelation and religion may be the most prominent offerings, they are not the only ones. Many theological projects are framed with words such as revisit, reclaim, restore, return, renew, renovate, reimagine, revive, re-examine, reinforce, react, respond, redeem, and retreat. Did I miss any? Anyone think of any others?
Recreate or recreate?
Recreate? Okay.
Redemption.
Well, I had redeem on there, but yeah, okay, yep.
My friend's church.
Okay.
Redefine.
Redefine. Oh, well, I could go with redefine actually, but we'll get there. Okay.
Reframe.
Reframe. Okay. Cool.
We see reform.
Did I miss reform? Yay, a new one. Okay. Reform.
That's a biblical word. It's more of a Protestant word.
Nice. All right. My list just got bigger. All right.
Remembering.
I think I had that one, but I may not, so I'll write it down.
Represent.
Man, I thought I did so well, but there's only so many words, you know? It's amazing in our spiritual and theological project how many of them start with RE. And now I want to talk about why that's a problem. The above group of RE words is not sufficient for the challenge that we're up against. And I would argue that the nature of Christianity is incarnational, what Tim said earlier. So the past is not the sole determining factor for our present or future expression. The problem with the past is that it is too easy to romanticize some notion or conception in isolation without addressing the larger structures of injustice and exclusion that it was embedded in or birthed out of. That's why we can't just reach into the back and reclaim, recycle, repurpose old words and concepts. There's a popular desire in certain schools of thought, as varied as the radical Orthodox movement to my field of practical theology, to reclaim some Aristotelian notions like polis or habitus or phronesis, enacted wisdom. This desire comes from a good place. There is a recognition, R-E word, that the modernity project has dried out and withered the Christian soul and left it without a vibrant connection and community, and stripped us of nearly all of our practices and praxis. So I agree with the diagnosis. The solution, however, is not simply to reclaim, recycle, repurpose ancient, antiquated, or Aristotelian concepts from the pre-modern world. And here's where I have found the work of Susan Heckman very illuminating. She says, MacIntyre's approach exemplifies a disturbing characteristic of much of communitarian literature: the romanticization of pre-modern societies that ignores the oppression and hierarchy that was endemic to those societies. Even Sandel, despite his modernist leanings, sometimes falls prey to the tendency to glorify traditional communities. The narrative selfhood that MacIntyre lauds can only be obtained at a high price: the ascription of traditional roles. When it comes to the highly charged issues of sexism and racism of the traditions he praises so highly, MacIntyre seems to abandon his interrelationship thesis. With regard to the Aristotelian tradition, he tries to deny the claim that sexism and racism are an integral part of this system of virtues. Throughout his writings, MacIntyre unambiguously asserts it is this traditional community we must foster if we are to return to any semblance of moral life. To thinkers like MacIntyre and Hauerwas, we are descending further into an age of darkness. Their answer is to reclaim or return to some former understanding or manifestation. Heckman's right, though. We cannot even attempt to do so without acknowledging and addressing the inherent racism, sexism, and disparity built into every level of the structures from which those romantic notions come. So I'm going to put the brakes on a second before we turn the corner. Any questions, comments, concerns at this point? All right, let's talk about Mad Max. The recently released Mad Max movie, Fury Road, anybody seen it? Oh, a couple, okay. Provides a metaphorical inspiration for the road ahead. After their civilization has collapsed, society begins to break down and both gas and water become scarce. A warlord named Immortan Joe rises to become a tyrant in charge of a fortified city called the Citadel and a dedicated army of war boys. Charlize Theron plays a character named Furiosa, who is tasked with driving an armored tanker to Gastown, a refinery that Joe owns. Things really get going when Furiosa turns off the main supply road and takes a sharp left turn that causes alarm in the Citadel and sets off a series of events that will ultimately lead to the overthrow of Joe's tyrannical reign and the liberation of the struggling masses. Like Furiosa, in order to seize an alternative, which is why we're here, we must make a dramatic and sharp left turn off the well-trodden highway and embark on an off-road adventure of desperation and liberation for the captives of this tyrannical and oppressive system. Jesus is quoted as saying that wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, Matthew 7. And followers of Jesus should have no hesitation at all about turning off the well-trodden road between government, the Citadel, and the economy, Gastown, in order to pursue a narrow road that leads to life. Mark C. Taylor, in his contributing chapter of Theology at the End of Modernity, tackles the danger of a parousia delayed or deferred, suggesting that the RE of religion marks a repetition, a compulsion, that neither solves nor heals, but remarks the devastating space that is the dead time of non-apocalyptic disaster. He suggests what fundamentalism is in all of its varieties, that it grows out of a deep sense that something is wrong with modernity. In the wake of the confusion, he says, and uncertainty brought by the pluralism and relativity of modern culture, there is a pervasive nostalgic longing to return to the peace and security of a world in which seemed notable and morality doable. And this assertion directly correlates to a profound depth of what we're up against in our era. He uses Blanchot's notion of disaster, who says disaster ruins everything, all the while leaving everything intact. It does not touch anyone in particular. I am not threatened by it, but spared, left aside. It is in this way that I'm threatened. It is this dual nature of both consequence and elusiveness that permeates our existence after the end. We keep going on though we feel lost. We're lonely even though we're never alone and always connected to the web. We cannot rest even while we're exhausted. We are bored while we are constantly active. We have more stuff than we could possibly use, but are afraid to lose even the little that we feel we have. And as long as we continue to travel the well-worn route between the Citadel and Gastown, we will, even unconsciously, reinforce and reinstantiate the systems and structures of the past that have delivered us to this new and regrettable era. If we want to seize an alternative, we're going to have to be willing, excuse me, to take a sharp left turn off the wide road which leads to destruction and forge a new and living way that avoids the endless roundabout debates so prevalent in our identity politics, our religious camps, and our gender sex formulations. So my proposal is twofold. One, that we repent of our attempts to engage in projects that begin in RE. I think we have to start there. Number two, in order to break our addiction to these former ways, I propose that we discipline ourselves to engage only in projects that begin with vowels as a starting point. So my three tripart suggestions would be examine, imagine, adapt, or explore, address, evolve, or investigate, interrogate, innovate. I'm not really that picky, as long as it doesn't start with RE. The constructive options are nearly endless. Seize, occupy, inhabit, cultivate, imagine, curate, and invest, to name only a few. Whichever formulations one decides to embrace, it's important to recognize that the context in which we do so provides the architecture, the space, in which our spiritual and theological project exists. And for us, that is the end. That's our context. This is the end. What we do within that framework provides the furniture that houses the activities we wish to engage in. So I end my presentation with the words of Mark C. Taylor that he uses to conclude his chapter in Theology at the End of Modernity. The end is approaching, has always been approaching from the beginning. Still, it seems closer today than ever before. We are on the edge of disaster, under its threat. That threat is real, and we delude ourselves by trying to deny or repress it. Can disaster be delayed? Will it be deferred? We cannot be sure. If there is hope, then it lies not in certainty, but in uncertainty, not in security, but in insecurity, not in foundations, but in their faults, not in cures, but in wounds. That wound might be our hope, small hope, fragile hope, nothing more, nothingness, impermanence, the world's continual breathing.
Wow.
Let's talk.
That's how he ends the book.
That's how he ends his chapter
His
in the
chapter.
book. The world's continual breathing. The world will go on without us.
With grasshoppers.
Yeah. But for us, this might be the end.
So,
Yeah.
John Dominic Crossan uses the image of the great divine cleanup like, for eschaton.
Yeah.
Yeah, right?
If this is God's house,
Right.
and the fact that it's a wreck says something bad about the homeowner.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So I'm just wondering if you would, if your concept embraces that notion that, you know, what the eschaton is really about is, you know, this great divine cleanup of changing this world, this era, you know, putting an end to this era for something better, or if you're really talking about, you know, a really cataclysmic, more physical end of the world.
So I love the concept of tikkun olam, the restoration, the healing of the world. But I am nervous about reclamation projects that are hoping to turn the tide and stave off ecological and economic disaster. What I'm saying is maybe we're already in it, the end, and so all of the language and the hope that we draw from maybe staving it off or something, maybe it's time to give up on that and go a completely different direction. And just acknowledge, like, we crossed over some threshold, this is it. And within that recognition, to start living a different way.
Let me see if I can say it and then ask you a question. So, frantic effort that tries to get back to where we were
Yeah.
could be very different than the kind of effort that starts creating what will be better in the future.
Yeah.
I'll just make the comment that, you know, when I look back on my use of those words, all the re-words, I, to some degree, was using those words to gain credibility among the people who really believed that it was better in the past. And so, in a way, what you say is, I'm going to re-Christinate the past, or, you know, the past is just as good as you said, and we'll, you know, try to get something like that again. But I think this is a very processy understanding to say, no, it's not that the past is better and we got to get back to it. It's that all of this is continually pregnant with new possibilities.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so many reasons why we can't go back. Number one is it doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
We couldn't go back if we wanted to. Let's say that I discovered that one of my ancient ancestors was a flute-playing shepherd in Germany, right? And so I decided, like, you know, I'm going to reclaim that heritage. Here's the difference. If I decided to become a flute-playing shepherd in Germany, I would not be doing the same thing he was doing. Because I'm doing it in a different era, I would be doing some type of performance art, psycho circus, anti-capitalist something, right? But he was just making a living or doing his vocation. So even though we do the same activities, and this is why, like, and I might step on toes here, this is why I think conceptions of the Eucharist and liturgy, anything that is backward looking is hurting us. And that's just my conviction. We can't ever go back. We can't go back to former understandings of metaphysics. We're not using the same essence language that the creeds are formed in. I just think that whenever we try and go back and reclaim, recycle, repurpose, that we're actually reinforcing the very systems that delivered us to the place we're now trying to get out of.
But there's nothing new under the sun.
I heard that.
Do you know
I heard
what I
that.
mean? Like, so I'm with you. I love apocalyptic narratives.
Yeah.
But I feel like there's a risk, like, of this
Sharp left turn.
absolute like break that you're
Uh-huh.
saying, where you leave
Yeah.
behind, like, you also divorce yourself from an awareness of the way we've been shaped and the culture and what brings us to where we are and how we connect with all those things and all the things that, like, I do like a processy way of thinking about the way that the past, like, shapes us.
It informs us.
It informs us and shapes us and gives us the possibilities where we are, and
It doesn't provide all of the possibilities.
it doesn't. It just seems absurd to say that there's nothing new under the. Like, there's no. Sorry, I'm just fighting with you.
No, it's fine. No, this is why I brought this. I knew that I was bringing session 8. You guys have already had lunch, and I wanted to bring something I thought we could talk about.
Yeah. Like, what about, like, it's not a return, but, like, working with the past that has brought us to where we are, oppressions and violences and things, and cutting those off can be damaging to the future. You know, you have to be working with that. I think.
Okay. So that would be the, no offense here, that would be the common approach. That's what people are trying to do.
Uh-huh.
I'm nervous that the longer we stay in these well-worn treads,
Uh-huh.
the longer
There are
we will
parts of our
stay
past that we
in.
haven't like looked at, like things to do with race and things to do with, like I keep talking about being in Turkey last week where they're like suppressing their like genocides in the past and
Right.
stuff, and there's like wounds in our country all over the place. And part of it is like not, so I'm just saying that there can be risks in doing that where you like are imagining a clean slate where there's not one.
I never said clean slate. We
Yeah.
never start from scratch. We never start at zero.
Uh-huh.
But we do start where we are. And if the project is in some way to reclaim some romanticized notion of
Sure,
the past,
I totally support that.
it's dangerous.
Yeah, I support that.
Yeah.
I just,
So we always start with where we are and what we have.
Uh-huh.
I'm saying as we conceptualize our project to seize an alternative,
Uh-huh.
it cannot be in any way backward looking.
Sure, it cannot, like, that's as
Yeah.
absurd to say, like, to say that it's absolutely new as to say that it's like totally.
But often when
different.
we're trying to form coalitions,
Uh-huh.
what we try and do is make concessions to bring more people in,
Uh-huh.
right? As if that's success, if there's more diversity or if there's more,
Concessions
right?
in what way, though?
So to lose sight of what the bigger project is. So if you, for instance, want to, I was just up at a conservative Christian university. I was visiting my friend, and I got to interview an author that I wanted to talk to.
Cool.
And so if I wanted to work with them to get them involved in some of the projects that we're talking about, the concessions that we would have to make, whether it's doctrinal or whatever it is, to get them involved, right? And then we would feel like, woo, we just doubled our size. And like, right? But the thing is, what they're working for is a slightly improved or modified version of what we currently have. They want to keep the main operating system the same, but change a couple programs.
Uh-huh.
And that's what I'm speaking against.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. Eric.
I don't, spoiler alert if you haven't seen Mad Max, but I think it's a beautiful
Yeah.
illustration of what we're talking about because Furiosa has to go. We talked on Friday about living into heresy as Christian identity to confront the systems, the dominant narratives. And so Furiosa is searching for this place in the movie, this green place that she thinks exists, which actually does not exist anymore. But in the journey into her heresy, she finds the seeds that will actually be sown to
Yeah.
bring about new life.
That's right.
But it's that journey, and it's that point in the heresy when she realizes I can either go march forward onto death, or I can turn around and confront the system itself with the new seeds I found
Yeah.
to bring about new life.
That's-
And so for me, I feel like I live in this heretical, no one knows it yet, or some people know it, but like I live in this heretical space where if people actually knew what I thought, I would just be cast out. But I have to take what I've learned, I have to take the processed seeds and
Yeah.
march back towards the empire, which is terrifying.
Yeah.
So that's the only way to recognize that those seeds could get sown. And so if you go and look at what we talked about in the last session with the projects that happen outside of the institution, so that things can be brought to the institution and say, hey,
Yeah.
so there's that separation, but it's kind of coming back up.
That's a really good reflection. If you ever hear me do this presentation again and I work in the seeds, remind me it was you I got it from. All right? Because I may think like I came up with that. I got it from you. So, Tim.
A couple comments and then maybe a question. The first one, I was reminded when you were talking, I think it's Picasso who said, there's two ways to honor your grandfather. You can either wear his hat or you can have grandchildren. And so that kind of resonated with what you were talking about in the sense of reclaiming, like, do I wear my grandpa's hat forever and then pass it on to my,
Yeah.
or do you have grandchildren and kind of throw them out in the world? And so, that being said, I like where you're coming from. I also like the apocalyptic imagery because it's urgent.
Yeah.
I think there's also with the 4Ds maybe a fanaticism that can be associated with that, so how do we organize that? But I'm actually more curious about what do you do with a couple of terms, like Deleuze's notion of not just unfolding but enfolding.
Yeah.
So it's not just that we're moving forward, but there's also not a reclaiming, but there's a there's a sense in which even in like processing, like it's a folding back upon.
I'm so glad you asked this. So, Catherine Keller uses the folding and
Yeah.
unfolding too.
Yeah.
So here's the thing. This is why I love this so much.
Her next book is gonna be called Apocalypse After All.
What? Shoot. I'm leaving. So let's use two things that we know we fold, like origami, right? So let's say somebody folds, a master folds the origami and gives it to you so that you can like learn how to fold the origami, right? So you unfold it and all the lines remain. Here's the two interesting things about that. One is you can never, yes, you have unfolded it, but that paper has been changed because now it has the fold lines, right? You can't ever go back to a fresh piece of paper. But the other thing is, the more you fold and unfold it to learn, the more fragile those points of transition will become, right? So that's one type of folding. Another type of folding would be, I have this thing I do called Jehovah Babushka. And when I was in Russia and I watched women make bread, and it dawned on me that like, that's actually one of the best pictures I've ever seen for like the process of God's work in our lives. Is they would smash their fists into the dough to press out all the gas, and then they would fold it in, right? It was like this amazing, for me, word pictures. So you know how in the Old Testament they had like Jehovah Jireh, and there's like 136 names for God, and you can see them on like evangelical banners, like in the charismatic worship services or whatever. So I just start making up new ones like Jehovah Java, and but this babushka thing really spoke to me. But if you take the folding, like Keller talks about it, but every time you fold something new in, so let's say you're making a pastry and you put chocolate and you fold it in, right? Yes, you have brought it in a sense, but you have also changed or transformed it. In fact, the more you do that, the more the gases are activated and released, and you actually change the quality of the dough. Like, the folding and unfolding is fantastic, but let's not pretend you can never get that flour back to what it was. Once the process has kicked in, you are changing and going forward. You literally
But the
can't
past
go
is always
backwards.
with you, though.
I know, I'm not saying that.
Yeah.
But we're not going towards the past, and we're not interested in reclaiming something from the past. So what we have, we start with. But as we fold in new things, we are both transforming and moving forward, and will never return to the past.
Well, can I ask my second word real quick?
Yeah.
I was gonna say was, what does this do to the notion of prolepsis? So what I mean by that more is like,
Oh, it just got nerdy in here.
we do have a text for it. It's called Proleptic Proclaimer. So as one of them, I'm wondering, what does it do then to the past
Yeah.
actualized in breaking really real, like, new creation, whatever gets birth, that continues now forward, like, because there are things in the past. I'm just wondering.
So anybody who doesn't know what prolepsis is, it's a term, comes from theater, Greek and Roman, and it's sometimes in a play, there would be a break in, and they would actually show how the play was going to end. So that was a proleptic vision. You would actually see how the play would end, and then they would return to the story where you left off. So you already knew how it was going to end, but you had to watch the rest of the play to see how it unfolded and how you got there, right? So Pannenberg, and I point to Tripp because he's the one who introduced me to Pannenberg, talks about Jesus, and specifically the resurrection, as a proleptic event. That eventually, we know how the play ends. It ends in resurrection and new life. We just don't know how we get there, right? So that's prolepsis. So what I would say is, prolepsis is a really nice theory. It's a concept. I don't know if it's true. And Pannenberg even says, until it happens, we don't know that it's going to happen, right? It's like something we hold to, and it's a great concept, but I don't know if it's coming.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
It's fun word game, though.
Well, I was just wondering because if that's even just representative conceptually
Yeah.
as, like I said, an actualized real inbreaking of whatever happened in that movement that was catalyzed out of that, and that's also something that's taken shape in all these other various movements, then I'm just wondering, like, is that is that something that we can still expect to catalyze ourselves?
Let me say my one problem, and this is gonna sound so bad, but as long as Eric's being heretical, I feel safe. Like I can tuck him behind him and everyone will be like, well, he's not as bad as Eric. One of the things that bothers me about using Jesus language a lot, I know I'm on thin ice here, is that we often, because of this notion of how we think things work, we think that Jesus was like a rock that was dropped into the pond of history, and that the echoes, the rings that go out, affect, right, in greater and greater ways, that is, the influence of God is expanding. I hate that image so much, because in that analogy, we are actually losing power as we go out from the ring. I think that the church is Pentecostal, that the truest thing about the Church of Jesus Christ is that it's Pentecostal. And I don't mean speaking in tongues, I mean that the Spirit of God is with us to empower us to say things in a way other people can understand. Because the miracle of Pentecost wasn't the speaking in tongues, it was the understanding in their own language. The church is inherently Pentecostal. So I'm not interested, if I can be honest, and I love Jesus, don't get me wrong. But to focus so much on the Jesus event that God, like the eternal penetrated history, and it's that ring that's ever expanding, because in that analogy, we're losing power as we go, which actually might be more true than my little theory. But in my theory, it's more like a nuclear reactor, that it actually, in a positive feedback loop, it cycles back on itself, and it's intensifying as it goes, and the more people on the planet who come to know Jesus and the power of Christ's Spirit, the more powerful the church is. We're not losing power as we expand, that actually we're intensifying back on ourselves, and that the power of God's Spirit is with us for this work. So I'm far more interested in being Pentecostal than focusing on a one-time proleptic story. Am I allowed to say that?
That's helpful. Yeah,
Okay.
that's helpful. I'm just-
Brian's not happy with me. Yeah.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Cindy. Well, there's an interesting way, I mean, I think a fair reading of especially the fourth gospel, but like, the coming of the Spirit's a really big deal. Like, so you think for John, it's almost like Jesus doing all this stuff. John the Baptist prepares the way for Jesus. Jesus prepares the way for the Spirit. You really feel that when you read John. You really feel it when you read Luke and Acts together. There's this whole sort of theological thing that's been going on in my brain since I was asked to preach a couple months ago in the Revised Common Lectionary on the destruction of, or not what's called the cleansing of the temple passage. It's just had me thinking about this idea that the temple is this construction that we want to get rid of and get beyond. There's something way better than the temple, and that's the Spirit in all creation. So I do think there's actually a way to very faithful, you don't have to say that you're minimizing Jesus, as you say, but to say taking very seriously what Jesus was about was preparing the way for the Spirit.
So I really liked writing the story about the girl standing up and asking the test question, and you saying, I'm just going to give you your test back and just give me an F, and now let's talk about the things I really came here to talk about. And I think that that's part of the protest, is not getting bogged down in these endless theological or doctrinal or biblical arguments that exhaust all of us and bear no fruit. And one of the things I'm proposing is, like, if there is something, whether it's issues related to homosexuality or whatever it is, that instead of our primary thing being to be more inclusive of more people into a broken and unjust system, is saying, I want out of that debate. We're in serious trouble up in here, and we have to. So we'll figure it out. I mean, you may come over to my side. I may be wrong and pay for it on Judgment Day. We'll figure that out later. But we got stuff to do. And so to find those places of compromise and to say, like, I'm not going to debate this with you even one more time, unless we are cleaning up the Santa Monica oil spill. I will debate the physical return or penal substitutionary atonement or the clobber passages in the Bible with you if you will get some paper towels and come with me to clean up this oil spill in Santa Monica, right?
Rob had an anecdote on that recently that was really good. He was just saying how he's kind of over the Western idea of theologizing and kind of, he noticed like he would preach a 10-week series on something and then people would still be asking questions, but do we believe this or is it this? You know, and he's just saying that's an endless trail. So what he said was, in a Eucharistic community or whatever that even means, he's like, there's an invitation to the table, but there's also, let us show you what we believe. We believe in restoring marriages. We believe in cleaning up oil spills. We believe, you know what I mean? So it's a much more engaged, almost like activist way of you know, having some sort of theological conviction that's lived.
Yeah, and so this was my, just on this one single point, this was my attempt to say, from the world that I am from, there is still a lot of talk about the end of the world, the return of Christ, all that kind of stuff. And I have now decided that I'm going to concede that point to them. And you know kind of the joke, have you guys ever seen the joke, Jesus is coming, look busy? Right. But instead of making that a joke, I'm actually going to try and redeem that and say, hey, yeah, so if you think that's how this is going to unfold, we should get busy. Come with me. Right? And I'm just going to concede the point. This is the end of the world if we're not careful. We are living in the last days. I'm not interested in debating that with you. We got work to do. Yes. Well, here and here. Yeah.
So I'm thinking about one of the things that wasn't on your list was that Black Lives Matter, and one of the things as well is reparations. And so it feels convenient as two white men to say we need to not look back to the past and re-examine and act as though we're starting in this place. And so help me understand, like.
Yeah, I never said not look back or re-examine.
You said not to re-examine.
That those theological projects.
I think you need to be clearer that you're talking about a specific history in a specific context, because it sounds like you're talking about all history.
Oh, I'm not talking about all history.
And
history of empire.
So what you're mentioning, what I'm trying, so I interrupted you.
But you both are coming from the perspective that we somehow start from scratch or don't bring the past into the future with us.
I'm just saying, you said not to re-examine.
No, I'm saying that those words set off a trigger for me when you see a theological project or a spiritual undertaking that starts with RE. It alerts to me if we're talking about it in some way cleaning up something from the past to bring it into the future. That's going to be problematic for me unless we examine the hierarchy, the racism, and the sexism that are contained within it.
That's very helpful.
Okay.
Because it was sounding as though you were saying, like, you know, debates about like homosexuality. I don't want to have those anymore. I want to just get.
But if the end goal is to include more people in an unjust system and pat ourselves in the back because we've added a letter to our alphabet, that's not enough. Issues of human dignity and our entire way we do gender essentialization, the whole binary, even the spectrum, like all of that needs to be on the table because how those even concepts were delivered to us are born out of a system that has caused the problem. Okay, good.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, Paul.
The fact that you were up here talking about what you're talking about is an example of, you know, this conference is a perfect example of what we need to be doing and keep doing. And as it happens, some of them, not all of them being evangelicals or Catholics or whatever, will get on board and will help out. And I think that's where Brian's going with his vision of this guy going to teenagers. Let's set an example. Let's give them a vision. And hopefully, you know, and I know my kids, for example, are ready to get on board. They want to say,
right.
You know, they think the old evangelical belief system is bunk. They don't want anything to do with it.
If going to church on Sunday and believing the right things is the end, they're good.
Yep.
Like they'll just stay home. It's fine. But if you made a difference in the world, they'd come join you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Did you have something to say?
Yeah, I just have to share this. I posted on Facebook yesterday that I'm in this group, dozen people reflecting on the work of Alfred North Whitehead, an ecological civilization and the church. I said, what question should I ask? And so this guy says, what do you do when scripture seems to go against natural law and is used as a justification to destroy the world based on linear philosophy that the earth is going to end with a tribulation that some Christians believe? You know, so this conversation is just great. It's like the answer to the question. But what I want to ask is a little more specific, because if I understand, you know, and I'm not a dispensationalist, far from it or anything, you know, the tribulation happened in 67 to 70, as Brian opened with here a couple of days ago. But in that belief system, Jesus returns, right? So what is your concept then of the return of Jesus in this, if we're in this end times? And let me just add one thing to that.
Yeah.
I got a paper from a Jewish friend who argued for the return of Jesus as the end of war. He said, if we could just all embrace this concept, if we can end war, then the Messiah has come back. Great concept, you know. So, do you have a concept like that in this notion of the end of the world that we're about to, what does the return of the Messiah look like?
Well, you know, I talk with people a lot about the apocalyptic sections of Scripture, and just found being really kind about either the poetics involved in that, or maybe the politics, like the book of Revelation, and its political critique of the first 2 centuries and how significant that was. And usually they'll do one of two things. They'll either go, oh, it's not about the future, it's not a predictive, it's like a critique. Because I'm actually saying what would be great is if we stopped thinking that the book of Revelation was about the 21st century. One of the things that would do is we would recognize that what the book of Revelation did in its century, we need something like that for our century. But as long as we think we already have it, we have a failure of imagination. We have a complete absence of that political apocalyptic critique because we think Revelation already has it, and it's like a placeholder. So that's the first thing, is just to like kindly explain. But the other thing is, not everybody's gonna give you the rope to hang yourself. They're gonna withdraw, because once they sense that you're doing any other reading other than what they're used to of those texts, they'll start shutting down. And because for a lot of people, the whole reason that they're in any type of spirituality or religious undertaking is because it provides, in a therapeutic sense, something that it provides a certainty for them. Now, the certainty can be the scripture or a denomination or an experience. And we get distracted by those flowers, but all three of those are rooted in certainty. That's what's really holding them there. And if you challenge that, they're gonna withdraw. They just may not be ready. But you can still clean up the beach with them. That's all I'm saying.
I mean, are you attempting to offer an alternate, we were talking about this yesterday, an alternate narrative of certainty in your reclamation?
Yeah, because
And how do you think that'll work, and how do you plan to stave off some of the problems that have arisen?
Yeah. So one of the things I've realized as I've matured and migrated theologically and moved geographically, is that, if somebody's a sailor and somebody's a farmer, it's not that one's right and wrong, but they have cultivated entirely different skill sets and expectations. So to put a farmer on a boat and to say, I'm sure you'll be fine, is not good. And to put a sailor in a cornfield and say, just stay here year after year. They've cultivated they're different personalities, they're different callings, they've cultivated entirely different skill sets. And so it's just to recognize, some people, they like living on solid ground, they do. Mm-hmm. So work with them on their soil, with their soil. And some people are wanderers, and then other people are mariners. And that's just how it works. And so to embrace and celebrate that there are people who don't need to be anchored or tethered to a dock, they really are fine to go out on the seas and navigate by the stars. That's an entirely different spirituality than the corn farmer. And so just for me to work with people where they are, but also to realize they have entirely different skill sets. And so to try and translate for them what could I say? This is the Pentecostal in me. What could I say that they could hear? There's no sense in me saying something I'm pretty sure is right if the person I'm talking to can't hear it. So what could I say that they could hear? And see if we can find middle ground or move them this way. Like that's just part of the Pentecostal impulse. Trip.
I professionally argue with you, so
That's true.
I think apocalypse is the problem with it is it creates a unity by monopolizing all the things around it to point towards one thing, and that's why when Catherine Keller is talking about apocalypse, she critiques kind of the normal progressive move at it, right, which is anti-apocalypse, and talks about a counter-apocalypse. But when you're doing that, it involves affirming a finitude and averting finality. And so I'm wondering if your apocalypse move is a pedagogical one for people that are concerned with that.
I think we'll still be having this conversation in 2,000 years.
What do you mean? I mean, so at the loft, how many people or even care about the end of the world? I'm saying, like, when we've talked about those end time texts, like, you'll explain to me why someone cares about it. So when I'm hearing everything you're saying, I'm thinking to myself, like, I would, one, have to get to know enough people, or smoke more weed, right? Like, so assuming that your mainline Protestant context, or people that are not Christian, like, do we need them to learn to sing Left Behind songs first?
If you're post-evangelical or no one, this little virus has been introduced into the hardware, like it's running. So whether
The
people,
apocalyptic mindset.
yeah. So if for anybody that I know that's post-evangelical or has a friend or family member who is, it's already running inside the. You know what I mean?
Oh, when you say give them ground, that's like the Christians, I think, I don't even know if we're in the same religion. Like, so giving them the apocalypse, I'm just like, no, that's like the part that whenever I meet that crazy uncle, I'm like, whoa, we're related.
But if they would clean up the beach with you and divest from fossil fuels, who cares?
See, and that's where Catherine is going with her apocalypse after all, because she's, theoretically would still be where she was with her previous book, but she's like, actually, literally, maybe the world is ending, like we're past the tipping point.
Yeah, like,
and so
we have crossed a threshold.
Yeah.
I have a couple of thoughts about this. One is that I come from the little sect that created dispensationalism and that whole eschatology. So Plymouth Brethren was my background. So I feel like I'm sort of an informant. And I have a suspicion, knowing that Brethren history pretty well, that apocalypticism comes in the 1830s. And if you think about the 1830s, you had the Methodist revival in England in the late 1700s. And you want to go back farther, you had the Presbyterians who made a big splash. And I think there was big hopes with that. It wasn't so great. Wesley's come along. It's going to be great. And by 1830s, that sort of died down. And I think there's this despair that, wow, these renewals keep happening and things keep being better.
Right.
And I think that urge to interpret the Bible, that the end is here and all that, I think it has nothing to do with, well, it has very little to do with actually believing the world's going to end, because nobody acts like it's going to end.
Right.
They keep their bank accounts and all the rest, But I think what it really is an expression of despair.
Yeah.
And the irony is, to the degree that people really believe that, and that's what's working, they won't come clean up the beach with you. And they won't divest, because deep down, this is not a statement about what I think is gonna happen. It's almost an expression of a mood. It's all hopeless, and our best hope is to get beamed out. And it's sort of it's the ultimate divine
Right.
God out of the machine belief.
Well, this is how real that
Excellent.
attitude is.
Excellent.
I got married,
Excellent.
I got married in 1976, which is right after,
Yeah.
the age of Aquarius.
Our little window.
But that whole era was still very real. And my wife actually said, I hope Jesus doesn't come before we get married. I was pretty flattered, actually. But that's what our attitude
Yeah.
was. It was
Yeah.
like, it's gonna happen any day now. There's no reason to make any plans or save any money or get an education.
Yeah, I know. So I grew up outside Chicago with the Jesus people. And so when the 80s came and all of those people who hadn't saved and had dropped out of college and had made all those sacrifices, and now it's a decade later and the disappointment. So this is my 40s, the disappointment starts to come, right? So it is real. And the longer it goes on, like I said, the trip, I think we'll still be having this debate in 2,000 years. Like there's no army of angels coming over the horizon. There's no silver bullet. This is the end. We just live in it, perpetually deferred. This is what it looks like to live in the end. And we're poisoning. We're like a goldfish. Brian uses this analogy. We're like a goldfish poisoning our own bowl.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you
so-
don't have to be.
No. But debating people about the return of Jesus or whatever, this is why I wanted to propose it. It's like we can work with those folks who think that God's going to hit the big evacuation button or flush the toilet bowl or however you want to say it. We can work with them partially by saying it's been this way for a long time. I partly agree with you, but I'm not sure that the result is that we all get jump shooted out of here. I think we might be here a while. It just might be like this.
My own journey out of that belief system began with a younger man telling me that he thought the Left Behind series, the Left Behind story was Christian science fiction. All he had to say.
Really?
I go, I wonder if he's right.
Tim,
Start doing some research.
back to you.
Oh, and I was just gonna say, and that perspective has not disappeared. I've had a contentious theological dialogue with my dad for a long time. I mentioned with the Calvary pastor earlier, but he told me, we were debating about some other, locus of theology, but he said, you know what, I'm not even worried about your eternal destination. I'm worried that if the rapture happens, you won't be taken and you'll experience the tribulation. So I was like, oh man, you really don't, you're not worried about where I'm headed, but you're worried about my suffering and my family's suffering. And there's a grip.
Yeah. Just two quick stories. I grew up in a tradition that comes out of the 1906 Azusa Street revivals. In 1911, we split from the Assembly of God. So I'm from that charismatic evangelical background. And we're required to be, that we believe in a premillennial. That's the official stance, right? The return of Christ is
Can you
premillennial.
re-describe these words blow my mind every time?
So Jesus comes back before the 1,000-year reign. The
Which is
millennium.
real.
Which is real.
Yes.
Jesus
All right.
sets up government.
Yeah. So, but
All
here's
right.
the interesting thing.
In
I'm glad-
Alabama first?
Yeah, and I'm glad you
Yeah.
said that. But here's the interesting thing, is when I looked into it, at the turn of, from the 19th to the 20th century, more than 80% of churches in the United States were post-millennial. Meaning that as we, the Christian century, grew and ushered in these new measures, deals, things, that we would actually bring in the reign of Christ. 100 years later, it's like 4 or 3% are post-millennial. The 20th century destroyed that kind of optimism, but it's not just in the church, just the utopian notion. And so we live in this constant state of both discouragement and hopelessness with the rise of consumerism. Like,
The Christian Century. I mean, just the name of the magazine was built
yeah,
on that.
I know. I think it's hilarious that we're now in a different century and it's still called that, right? You talk about decline. All right. Yes.
And so I like what Brian was saying about the idea that there's like a real hopelessness that comes with apocalypticism, and I'd be curious how y'all, and interestingly there's a corresponding thing in queer theory where they've been like dismantling like teleological heteronormative time, you know, for liberation, but then they find themselves like, what are we hoping, like,
Yeah.
how do we have hope, you know, what are we hoping
Yeah.
for? So I'm curious how y'all would construct a narrative of hope in the face of dismantling this deferral narrative.
So I will say, this is because I study with Barry Taylor. Brian may say something different. I would say it's way too early to talk about hope. Until the stark reality of what we're up against settles in, there's no need to talk about hope. We have to, because we're not trading one
How
narrative.
do you think the nihilism, like, of like, that realization?
The lure of hope, that carrot that we perpetually hang out in front of people, I think is part of the problem. Now, we will come to hope. But what happens is when people are confronted with the stark reality of how bad this really is, they go, hold on, unless you have a better option, I'm just going to stick with what I have, right? And this is a form of re-entrenchment. So that in itself, to me, is part of the problem, is that one of the reasons we are in such deep doo-doo is because we are unwilling to acknowledge how deep of doo-doo we're really in.
So you want to counter Jurgen's theology of hope with theology of despair?
Let me offer a different
Yeah.
perspective. First, I think I understand your perspective, and I hear this from a lot of people your age.
How old do you think I am?
Well, yeah, if you were around in the 70s, that's, but,
Young kid in the 70s, come on.
and I didn't mean that in a
No.
diminutive way.
You would have guessed young, it would have made him feel good.
Yeah, but, and I think that's a very valid response, facing the denial in huge numbers of people. But I think it has two serious problems. The people who tend to be in the denial the most are the most privileged people. They have the most to lose. And they have the most power. So it's really worth having a strategy for them. But requiring everybody else to play by the rules of those powerful people whose minds you're trying to change by rubbing their nose in the gravity of the problem could have some unintended consequences. So I kind of wish there was a way you could make this point, but say, for this audience of people, that's my strategy. Because I think there are probably other audiences where a different strategy is needed. Because it's a little bit like this one-size-fits-all thing that we see as being problematic for other people. So, because and there are 100 different ways that hope can be problematic. But I also think that, for example, you weren't here this morning, but the talk we heard this morning about this big breakthrough in agriculture, right? There's certain kinds of work that you don't do if you think there's no hope. And we need a lot of that work to get done. Just a quick story on this. If y'all, I'm not sure anybody in this room needs to read the book, but it's actually just so well written that you might enjoy it. But there's a book called The Song of the Dodo. It's about extinction and about humans never believed that they could commit extinction of other species. It's a lot like the climate change deniers. Their theology said, God made the creatures, we could never make them go extinct. And the dodo was the first species that they understood they went extinct. And so then it's got by a guy named David Quammen, and he uses that story to then talk about all the species going extinct and all the rest. And you get near the end of the book and you're just thinking, there's no hope, you know? Like, the rate of extinction is just skyrocketing. And you turn, like I remember reading the book thinking, I don't think I've ever been as depressed when I'm reading a book. You turn the page and it says, right about now, you know, or somebody asked me recently, do you have any hope? He says, no, I have no hope. And then he says, then somebody said, well, why are you writing this book and why are you out there doing everything you can? He says, I'm acting against hope. Like, I'm trying to do the right thing, even though I have no hope.
Yeah.
And in a bizarre way, it was like, that's the most hopeful thing I've ever heard. Because and it reminded me of that, you know, scripture, Romans 4, in hope against hope he believed. And
Yep.
all of these calls to do the impossible. And that to me is the other little trick in the middle of this, that there's a kind of hope that says, it's not really that bad, we're going to get through it. There's another kind of hope that says, it's really, really that bad, and we're going to do the right thing anyway.
Yeah. Well, I just want to say thank you, everybody, for entertaining this at least and giving it some pushback and as I refine it. And I just want to close by saying, even so, come Lord Jesus. Oh no, it's you guys.